welcome to the 6th episode of Witty CFB, and I'm your host Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Jaden Rashada lawsuit that was just filed this morning. And for those of you who don't know, the general gist of the lawsuit is Jaden Rashada, who was a top recruit of the 2023 class, initially signed a letter of intent to go to the University of Florida, and then there was an NIL deal that was agreed upon, and then it pretty much fell through, so he decided to go to Arizona State, which is where his father played college ball, and that didn't end up working out either, and then he just recently transferred to Georgia as of last month. So just to preface, I'm not a lawyer. This is just anything that I'll say is opinion based, and I also have a couple articles here that I can also allude to as well. But the general gist of what's going on is essentially the Rashada camp and their lawyers are pretty much saying that he was defrauded. We'll use defrauded and perhaps even misled, I think could be a little bit more applicable here. But in essence of really what happened is the Rashada camp is pretty much claiming that Florida's NIL, which is called the Gator Collective, which I don't believe is active anymore, but in essence they're claiming that they never had any intention of paying these funds out. And there's a lot of layers to this, and obviously just for a little bit more context too, there was some conversation of initially the University of Miami offering this quarterback Jaden $9 million to go play for them as well, and then Florida kind of came back at the last second and said, hey, we'll do it for I think it was 13.75, I think is the number. 14, 4-year $13.85 million NIL deal. And I'll read a little bit of the excerpt here. I think probably the most important part is just kind of knowing who the parties are. You got the Jaden Rashada camp, then there's Florida, Billy Napier, his staff, the school, whatever, and then outside of that is what we call the Gator Collective, which is the independent franchising organization that distributes the money to the Florida athletes. And just for a little bit of more background too, the reason why Florida State got in trouble was because the school was directly getting involved with these NIL deals, whereas what's really supposed to happen is they're supposed to be kind of an independent organization that's supposed to kind of be the one to say, hey, well, we're willing to pay this kid $1 million, we're willing to pay this kid a $500,000 signing bonus. And even though the NIL, all that stuff has really kind of been the wild, wild west in terms of college football, to me the easiest way to explain the NIL to a regular fan is to pretty much it's sort of a contract, but I would go as far to say that, at least in my opinion, it's more of a signing bonus. I think is the easiest way to explain it, where it's almost like when you get a new job and they say, hey, here's a $20,000 signing bonus, and you have to move. If you have to move to Dallas, Texas or something, they say, hey, we'll give you a little bit extra money to help you move too. I think to me the NIL is a big wild, wild west thing, but to me, if you're talking about just the basic general gist of what the NIL is, to me the easiest way to explain it is just it's pretty much just a signing bonus for a player. I think it's the best way to explain it. So as you go along here, kind of discusses the actual lawsuit itself, which I just alluded to, and also just to let everybody know, Jaden was with Arizona State first year with Kenny Dillingham, and he did not perform very well. I mean, he had started 2 games. He was injured for the most part. Threw 82 passes, 485 yards. So as far as I can see, he didn't really do that well. And what's kind of next for him is he's going to be with Georgia, and I've read some reactions online, and obviously the Reddit rabbit hole, take that with a grain of salt, but what kind of stood out to me was a lot of people were kind of saying like, oh, this is just Kirby Smart, kind of being the puppet master, and he kind of, I know there were reports saying that he kind of green-lighted the lawsuit. And there's two things I want to add to that. Number one, I don't think it really matters whether Kirby Smart okays anything, because at the end of the day, Jaden being there doesn't. He's at best the backup quarterback. Like if it was Carson, if Carson Beck was the one doing this, I don't think there's any way in hell that Kirby would be like, yeah, Carson, go ahead and sue the old school that you were at, and we'll be okay with you having this big circus going in 100 days into the season. So I think that's number one. I think to some degree, I think Kirby believes that this kid is expendable, because he totally is, and anybody that doesn't think that is wrong. You're trying to tell me at the University of Georgia they can't have a couple backup quarterbacks in there. Now, granted, I believe that there are some young guys. I think there's one kid that I think has been there for maybe 3 seasons. I don't know his name, and then there's another kid that they recruited who's pretty much, I believe he's a freshman. So if I'm Kirby, I'm not too, when you have a guy who's pretty much a Heisman Trophy candidate coming into the season, I don't really think you're worried about this Jaden kid filing a lawsuit against Florida. Now, aside from the whole Georgia aspect of it, let's just talk about the plausibility of whether this kind of has any sort of any sort of bearing at all. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer or anything, but my gut reaction to this is, to me, this seems like one big money grab. I think the Rashada camp realized that they didn't cash in like they did at the beginning, which they should have either taken. Which, if they realized that the Florida deal wasn't going to pan out, they should have just took the Miami deal. So if you legitimately thought that Florida didn't have the funds to pay them, you should have just took the Miami deal. So that's number one. And then number two is, the reason I also think this is kind of a bullshit lawsuit is, the part that doesn't make sense is why, the issue really comes down to, there is a part of the lawsuit that said that Florida, pretty much the school, Billy himself said, we're guarantee you $1 million pretty much deposit on the deal. Now, if Billy was the one who guaranteed that on behalf of the school, I think there is a little bit of wrongdoing there to some degree. I think he could get some heat for that. But again, that's hearsay. We don't really know the detail. There's going to be some more paperwork and filings and all that, so we'll figure that out as time comes along. Because I think that's the one thing that he could get in trouble for, is the fact that if Billy is the one saying, yes, on behalf of the school, we will start off by giving you this $1 million signing bonus and going from there, then there could be something wrong. But I think the reality of this whole thing, it's not necessarily, because the one thing that was interesting is I read this Twitter post from Hal Lewis, who is pretty much is an attorney, and pretty much what he's kind of getting at is, I'll just read the first sentence, or it's pretty much a whole paragraph, but the first part, and I quote, often been reported that Rashada's UF NIL contract allowed either side to terminate it at any time for any reason. This is probably why it's pled as a simple breach of contract case. Very important distinction. So instead of it being a breach of contract, they're calling it a tortious interference of contract case, which essentially means that he was defrauded out of the Miami money because Florida pretty much was either A, never going to pay him, or B, they never had the funds to pay him. Now, I know the whole thing kind of fell through in general. I don't know, we can only sit here and speculate in terms of why it fell through. It could have just been a disagreement. It could have been about the money. It could have been anything. But the reality of what's going on is, it doesn't make sense for Florida to trick this kid into signing when it doesn't make sense for them to trick him and his family into really signing this deal. I think to me what probably happened is I think the whole Rashada camp kind of fell asleep behind the wheel and probably didn't review the contract as thoroughly as they should have, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't really matter, if either side can terminate the contract at any time, he also didn't enroll in the school either. So ultimately, it's kind of a lot of layers that really kind of aren't making sense for the Rashada camp. And regardless of we can talk about his football acumen, all that another time. I think he's overrated personally, but that's neither here nor there. But I think the moral, kind of the general gist of the story here, and I think how Lewis does a really good job at kind of summarizing this I think you had a guaranteed deal with Miami, and instead of going with Miami like your gut should, like your intuition's telling you, they decided to hold out, try to get that extra $3 million or extra $4 million, and ultimately it didn't really pan out. So I think what's ultimately going to happen is I think the Rashada camp is really kind of looking for some sort of settlement where they can kind of partially get the money back. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Florida exercised being able to terminate the contract well before he signed a letter of intent. So he was technically free to sign the Miami deal afterwards, or the Arizona State deal afterwards. So, there's a big difference between, in the words of Hal Lewis here, there's a big difference between being misunderstood or miscommunicated versus fraudulent. So, I mean, we'll see what happens, but, my gut reaction, just kind of what I've seen from, the sports lawyer Hal Lewis, and also another great website is Sportico. They have a law column by Michael McCann, who also does a really good job at kind of analyzing the NIL lawsuit, because this really could, kind of shake up some things if Jaden does kind of have any success, in terms of where do you kind of find that middle ground between, is it, with the whole house thing, they're also talking about, are they going to be an employee? Is it pretty much a signing bonus? Like, where do you kind of draw the line? And I think as these, lawsuits kind of come into play, you kind of opened up the floodgate of, these conversations happening. So, I mean, ultimately, there's definitely going to be some change here, and it's going to be, fascinating to watch. But in terms of this lawsuit alone, my gut's telling me that it's either going to get settled or it's going to get quickly squashed. So we'll see what happens here. But again, this is all opinion, all speculation. So see what happens.